The book of Proverbs in the Old Testament asks what I think is a great question. Have any mastered heavenly knowledge? Have any, in other words, come to know so much that they've put all questions to rest? You've put it all together, have you? Well, could any of us be so dumb as to think so? Well, perhaps so, and if so, well, you are, as Proverbs states, like the fool who attempts to catch the wind in his fists, or who tries to gather and to wrap up water in a piece of cloth. Like, how crazy. The point being that your attempt at mastery in this way is not how to relate to knowledge of the divine. That is, you cannot, by some controlling effort, seek to objectify your theology into some kind of airtight and waterproof package. For if you do, you will end up, like not a few before you, with a God too small, as J.B. Phillips once put it. That is, you'll end up with a concept of God that too neatly fits with how you would like the Almighty to be. For God is spirit, and like the wind, according to John's Gospel, blows where it wills, which is to say that God is not how the idolater would like God to be, that it, predictable and manageable and controllable. No, God instead is that reality that is more fluid and mysterious than anyone's manufactured certainties. Now, therefore, a contrasting approach to divine matters is a humbler one, a humble approach that instead of trying to contain and master things like the wind, like light beams or divine knowledge, a saner way is to relate to the divine through the practice of a certain kind of humility, to practice, in fact, like a holy hesitancy before that great mystery that we call God. In fact, we may be more firmly on track if we make it our practice to be quiet about what we think we know, and at best to stutter and stammer when we dare to open our mouths. My experience of those who haven't learned the art of stuttering and stammering, but who are instead chock full of their certainties, is to give these people a very wide berth. For in their presence, I always get the uneasy feeling that an argument is just around the corner, and or a sales job forthcoming. And two, I have the distinct sense that the packaged theology that I'm hearing is an expression of but a fragment of someone. Like, for example, a product of her head alone, or in contrast, his heart alone, and not a unified expression of the whole of his being. Now, with regard to the first of these packaged theologies, where the theology appears to be some kind of exclusivistic head trip, Jonathan Shimkin cautions, and I quote, "We may be in possession of the most refined intellectual understanding and yet fail to touch or alter in the slightest our moral and affective life." So a theology of the head alone, for example, tends to assert, without even a pause, without any kind of struggle, it tends to make claims such as, "I've got it now." Like, this is the one true understanding of things. The assertion of which is surely an indication that the claimant is walled up and hiding behind some kind of sheltering fortress. He's duped himself into believing his own beliefs and is bereft of that healthy dose of skepticism that inhibits fanaticism. So, you see, a healthy skepticism must always remain, as the great philosopher Daniel N. Robinson emphasized, for, and I'm quoting him, "You must be able to continue to say that no matter how much this means to me," like your beliefs, your theology, whatever it might be, no matter how much it means, no matter how centered your being is on this pattern of beliefs, no matter how close you are personally and emotionally, and even romantically to those who hold such convictions, here's Robinson, "I must reserve the right to question and to doubt. I will retain," Professor Robinson continues, "this skeptical bias as an obligation owed to my own rationality, to my own integrity. I'm prepared to follow," he says, "the golden cord leading me out of the labyrinth, no matter how many twists and turns there are, because once I let go of that, my intellectual life is not my own. So lose that reason, suspend that criticality, you become gullible and end up accepting something that custom is serving up. And you enter, he says, the life of a puppet on a string. So, okay, the writer of the Proverbs is, to sum up, saying that there's something askew, something's wrong, something's missing, when the attempt is made to contain the Almighty, to control him in some kind of tidy, pretty package, like I call it my theology, I've got it here. Well, the God you have then may or could well be a God too small, a God too predictable, a God too manageable. You have, as Carl Jung put it, you have God without while remaining empty within, God without, nothing within, and are sure to be a royal pain to have around. Now, the contrast to trying to contain a beam of light and that kind of thing is to relate to the divine in an entirely different way. It's to understand that there's a knowledge that is more like a power that flows in and through you. You don't so much try to master this knowledge, but instead you seek to be a vehicle of it. You understand that there's a knowledge that is, as Robinson puts it, an introspective activity. Think of that. Knowledge is an introspective activity. It's synonymous with communion. There's a knowledge which is a communion with God, a communion with the cosmic mind. In the ancient Upanishads, this force or power is called Brahma, which by its presence gives reality to things and gives reality to us. The Upanishads say, he who knows Brahma as the real, as knowledge, obtains all his desires. What's that? It obtains all his desires? Yeah, it reminds me of a quote, I'm going to put it in my own words, from C.S. Lewis, where he talked about there's a yearning, a deep feeling, a deep longing that in a certain sense is more satisfying, more fulfilling than any other kind of satisfaction or fulfillment. Well, this is a communion with God. So much, again, not so much knowing about, but actually flowing with what is, flowing with reality. So the challenge here is to become an open, inquiring vessel who doesn't so much seek to contain the divine in your own limited understanding, but to be transformed and empowered by the divine. And to be therefore like the plant in a story I'm about to tell, which is told by Lisa Stanyan. This is such a great story. One day, Lisa noticed, while she was waiting for an appointment in a busy windowless office, that there was a lone, thriving plant that had directed itself gracefully up a wall and around a corner to reach for the sun rays streaming through a distant window down the hall. She describes the plant in this way. It wasn't tall or straight, but there was tremendous beauty. This is where the beauty was. There was tremendous beauty in its bending and striving, in its dedication to itself and to the light. This simple plant had met its maker. That's what was impressive about it. And I was struck silent, she says, by the radiant success it now enjoyed. For Lisa, it was a symbolic expression of longing, that yearning for completion or union or truth, and my heart cried out in recognition of how all of life longs to live in the light. She continues, I was leaving that office a few hours later, and I stopped abruptly in the doorway, the way you stop when you're on the verge of remembering something, and turned back to look again at that plant. For a few seconds, I just stood still, puzzled. Then I noticed that this was the kind of plant to not live long without light. Surely it must have taken weeks for the plant to journey such a great distance to the light. And in that moment, she says, with people brushing past me in the doorway, I began to consider the plant's long journey, knowing with a rather startling certainty that it was the act of reaching that I found so compelling. As she contemplated the plant's efforts to be nourished by the light, she was led to the realization that the reaching of the plant towards the light was her own deepest yearning as well. And she recalls then in her article that enormously difficult period in her life when she had literally lived in the dark. At the time, she'd been recuperating from surgery on her spinal cord. And where she was, no sunlight reached the room. Quoting her, I spent a long time motionless in unrelenting pain, waiting impatiently for my spine's damaged nerve roots to heal and watching the shadows dance and jaunt and leap about beneath the leaves and branches of several enormous trees. I ached to stand out there with the trees, and I longed to see the sun. Well, everything changed because of something that happened one day. A friend brought her an icon, and the picture was placed in front of her window so that every time she looked towards the window, she would see the picture of the saintly Gurumai Chidvilasananda. And once she says, I was just lying there smiling, gazing into her eyes, and I realized that I felt happy and totally content. Well, Lisa calls the quest of the plant for the sun its pure yearning, and realized that the deepest thing about her, too, was her own pure yearning. And it reminds me of the prayer of the psalmist who said, one thing I've asked of the Lord, that I will seek after him, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. So this is that communion that Robinson was talking about. The psalmist is writing of seeking, dwelling, gazing, inquiring. This is knowledge. His whole being is involved in the quest, in other words. This yearning, this deep longing is a level of knowing. It's on an entirely different level than the kind of external knowing that the writer of Proverbs finds so wanting. It's a level of knowing characterized by a vital inner search for the light. It involves the felt sense of the power and force of God moving through you, enabling you to breathe, to think, to live, and to be. In him I live and move and have my being. In him I live and move and have my being.